This is the sound of all of us, singing with love in the will to trust.
So welcome to this closing conversation as we try to wrap our heads and hearts around what does it mean to have been here for these 3 days and to be compelled to walk out these doors, to live and give and speak and be and serve as Jesus would. So what we thought we would do this afternoon is just do a little sharing among the three of us about what do we see after having been here together these 3 days. What do we see when we think of a church beyond 2020? A church into 2030, into 2050, into the second half of this century. So I'd like to invite Charlene to begin.
Thank you, sister. When I sat down to put some thoughts together, I had started thinking, wow, everything that I have seen and heard here thus far was connecting in so many ways for me. And I am so privileged to be sitting up here supported by these two wonderful people and the calibre of speakers and presenters we have witnessed at this wonderful conference. I've sourced, so I thought, how could I pull this all together? And I thought I'd take from the inspiration of whom I've heard from, so people such as Father Noel, talking about mission with, not to people. Robin talking about the diseases of leadership. And sister yourself, when you gave us the lovely takeaways of the acronyms of love and fear. And I began thinking, this is a great place to start. Love and fear. And it made me reflect on a speaker that I've heard, Brené Brown, who talks about the power of vulnerability. And I thought, wow, this is where I want to start. On stage right now, in my own vulnerability, scared as a novice, I'm taking one step at a time. And in her research, she talks to multiple people. And one thing she says is if you want to talk to people about love, they'll tell you about heartbreak. If you want to talk to people about belonging, they'll tell you about the pain of exclusion. And if you talk to people about connection, they bring up disconnect. And I thought, wow, the power of that. We go to the opposite. So I was thinking about all these opposites and how she talks about how these things come together as shame and fear. And she says the less you talk about shame and fear, the more you actually have it yourself. And I thought in my vulnerability, I wanted to be here as my true, authentic self, my own identity. And in working out my own belonging and being seen and heard here today. And she speaks about vulnerability from a different place that I had never thought of before. She says there's a huge misconception that vulnerability is about weakness and that this is profoundly dangerous and we need to move away from this. She says that we need to look more at vulnerability in terms of beauty and what it can actually offer to us, because we can't actually be vulnerable and we can't know vulnerability to then know courage. These two things go hand in hand, vulnerability and courage. So thinking about a church beyond 2020, I started thinking about being courageous and what I would hope for a church in our future. And I thought about the courage to have dialogue. And we've all been doing that here. We've heard about the mutuality of dialogue and how important it is to engage. And all of you here have been doing that. And I look around in the room and think, wow, isn't it a shame because the people that probably really need to be in dialogue maybe aren't here? And it made me think about plenary council. And I have been very fortunate in my diocese to help facilitate a lot of the plenary council and work with animators within my diocese. And I just wanted to share a story with you about an experience I had. I was working with one of our priests in the diocese who is retired, and nothing was going to happen in our diocese. And Father Bernie took it upon himself and said, yep, I'm going to do it. I'm retired, but I'm going to step back into this space. And he held a conference with all of our priests, and they meet only once, if twice a year. And he had said to this group of priests, you need to take your collar off when you're doing this. And one of the priests come up to him after and said, well, if I take my collar off, what am I going to wear? And there's two problems with that. One, what's wrong with wearing normal clothes? And the other was, he was speaking metaphorically that you need to be with and among the people. So then, also in reflecting, we've heard about Mary MacKillop and how she was excommunicated. She had the courage to stand up, and I was reflecting also on this morning, the courage I've seen in the lament from the prayer. There's one woman who especially comes to mind who blew my mind this morning. I was brought to tears almost. And I know it can be hard to engage in dialogue. I work with priests a lot, but if you don't step into that space to have that conversation, then who is going to? And if you don't do it, then you can't complain later. The other thing I think we need for a church moving forward is to come to terms with this gap between our cultural ideology and the gospel, and how this gap is becoming bigger and bigger over time, and our extreme need to recontextualise the gospel messages. Hopefully not the gossip. The gospel messages, not just for today, but for tomorrow. And there was I know, Phil, when you presented the panel not long ago, there was that lovely question about, well, what will be the issues in 60 years that we were supposed to be talking about now that we aren't? I also believe that it's not just moving forward a priestly solution, and I can only talk from my own experience. And as much as I believe that we should have married priests, or bishops should have the right to resign whenever they want, I think we really need to talk about this difference between small C and big C church. The people of God. This needs to come into our dialogue more than it is. Bring back this power of the laity. I also believe that we don't look to our youth enough. I'm very fortunate in my work that I work with a lot of schools and young children. And I can tell you now that they're the pioneers that we need to be looking towards. Because if you take a moment to stop and look, they're actually getting it pretty right in terms of what they're doing and what they're wanting to achieve. We facilitated not long ago in our diocese, and it was not done before, where all of our system leaders had come together with our school leaders. So we had a festival to celebrate the Year of Youth, and students from Year 10 and 11 sat at tables with our leadership. And unheard of, you wouldn't think, but it was very unheard of. And I had the opportunity to sit with the students before we went into this dialogue session. And one of the things I said to them was, do you know what? These adults are actually more scared of you than you are of them. And the things that these students spoke about were so profound, but yet so simple. One such thing is, well, why can't we sit at the leadership meetings and give them our thoughts and ideas? Why can't I sit across with my principal and tell him or her my ideas? Because they propose all of these things to us, but they're not working with us. So I got to thinking again about being a student at heart and how fearless children are. If we're talking about courage, children know how to take risks. We do this in the education sphere. We ask them to step outside their comfort zone, take a risk, but we don't take our own advice. We're quite the opposite, a little bit hypocritical. And I think as adults, we put up these invisible walls to protect us. And subconsciously, whether we like it or not, we have our own hidden agendas. We don't have that childlike mind. And we need to really go back to trusting that this is God's mission, not our own or anyone else's. And go back to asking questions, like the 3-year-old, those little toddlers. But why? But why? You give them a response. But why? Why aren't we asking why more often? What is the purpose of this? Who is it serving? Who is it not serving? And if it's not serving the right people, why are we not doing something about it? I hope that we don't have to hit rock bottom as a church to really know what a poor church is. I hope that we can be, one, vulnerable to admit we don't have all the answers, and two, be courageous enough to do something about it. So I'd just like to leave you with this one quote, and again, I'm referring all to the education sphere here, but you would know of these people in your schools who, if you or someone goes for a job and then the person in the staff room will say, oh, I don't think they really had the skills or the qualifications for it. And this person who is the critic is actually the same person who didn't actually have the courage to go for the role. So I have a quote here from Theodore Roosevelt, who you might have heard of. And sorry, I'm going to read word for word. It's actually summarised though. It is not the critic who counts. It is not the person who sits and points out how the doer of deeds could have done better and how they fell and stumbled. The credit goes to the person who's in the arena, and that's every single one of you here today, whose face is marred with dust, blood and sweat. But when they are in the arena, at best, they win. And at worst, they lose. But when they fail and when they lose, they do so daring greatly. I think a church beyond 2020 is everyone coming together in their vulnerability, vulnerable enough to have courage to dare greatly.
Well, thank you, Charlene. You said you were nervous. I don't believe you. It's another gossip we can put around, eh? Charlene's really not... after that presentation, I think all I can say is thank you, good afternoon, and goodbye. Particularly, as you've noticed, you've probably brought the demographic down quite a bit, so thanks for that. Look, I... again, would like to acknowledge the Indigenous land that we're on and the custodians of the place. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. And I start there deliberately in terms of a church for 2020 and beyond. Pope John Paul II came to Australia in 1985, Alice Springs speech. 86, thank you. And he talked about the church in Australia will not be the church that Jesus wants it to be unless and until the Aboriginal people have made their fullest contribution to the life of the church. We're not there yet. That hasn't happened, and it's not the fault of the Aboriginal people. So I think I start from that position to say that the church beyond 2020 has to have at its heart the Aboriginal, the Indigenous heart and soul of this place that we all call home. And for the white fellas, that means in the first instance probably shutting up and listening more than we have. So I strongly believe that's something that we need to embrace. And I heard echoes of it over the last 3 days, the notion of inclusivity as opposed to exclusivity, about choosing love over fear. That we're all in this together. People have commented about Noel Connolly's workshop, about we're all in this together, and that it's those outside the church who are actually going to make as fully contribution to the life of it as those who are inside. And I know from my own work, certainly with refugees, but in particular, the great gifts and the wisdom of Hindus and Muslims and Buddhists and people of all faiths and none enriches the life of the place. So that we won't ever have to tell that joke of the cement wall in heaven, where there's the Buddhist is lined up behind the Tamil, is lined up behind the Hindu, is lined up behind the Zarathustrian, and the other side, the Catholics, will think they're the only ones there. Those days have got to be gone. And I heard echoes of that here over the last few days. Can I ask all the women to stand up? Now, I might be wrong. I'm not no one can ever accuse me of being an accountant. But I think that's most of the room. And it seems to me, as a white middle-aged man who is often part of the problem of what we face, that a church beyond 2020 has to have women in leadership roles. Who told you to sit down? I'm still a white middle-aged man. I'm still a white middle-aged man. Please sit down. I mean, it's from the category of the bleeding obvious that that's what needs to happen. Robert made the point yesterday that if women had been involved in dealing with the abuse crisis, the outcome would have been different. And I completely agree with that. So a church beyond 2020 has to have women at its heart of its leadership. I think we got to this point, and let's be frank, there's an elephant in the room. It is the abuse crisis. It didn't surprise us, as Robert said yesterday, but it's shocked us, and I think it's traumatised the Catholic Church in Australia to its core. And that lament this morning, I think, really tapped into that. And wouldn't it be great if in parishes and communities across the country, that sort of lament could be something that our people could engage in, rather than just railing against what we see in the media about this and how that grief has got to be tapped into. And in that process, our Aboriginal people have got something to teach us. I was talking to someone the other day who was, worried about the trauma of the Catholic Church, and he was talking to an Aboriginal elder, and he just said, "Well, welcome to our world, brother." So that means, I think, a real active listening to reality. José Comblan, the Belgian theologian who lives in the Amazon, talks about the gospel pole versus the religious pole. Now, for the Western Church, in lots of ways, it's been wedded to the religious pole that requires a male hierarchical caste system. It's about tightening and straightening. It's about who's got the power, who's breaking the rules. Whereas the gospel pole sends us back to the social reality of people's lives, where they are lived. It's messy. Absolutely, it's messy. But it's where, as Cyril Halley said to me many, many, many moons ago, you've got to go to the edges, because you won't hear the truth of the gospel in the centre. You'll hear it at the edges. And of course, when you go to the edges, you realise you're not at the edges at all. You're at the heart of the show. It's a bit like the language we use. We talked in the workshop before about people talking about, remote Pacific Islands and remote Aboriginal communities. Well, they're not remote if you come from there. Sydney's bloody remote. London's remote if you live in Kiribati. It's home. So we've got to embrace, I think, in a way going forward that includes people. that fully includes women, that fully includes young people. And that's why it's so great to hear Charlene speak this afternoon. You know, I've got 3 kids, 2 stepkids, 1 grandkid. They don't go to church anymore, but they're fired up about the need to see justice in the world. And it occurred to me a number of times that in lots of ways, and I guess I have responsibility too in this exercise, they didn't leave the church left them. You know, where's the place? And if you get a church that can be relevant to the lives of people who are under the age of 50, under the age of 40, then I think you have a future going forward beyond 2020, but it's a future that would be engaged with the world. So that when we hear our leaders on Christmas give their Christmas annual message, our young people don't want to hear how hard the church has got it. You know, we've had in recent years been told, oh, the church has an annus horribilis because of the abuse crisis and because of the same-sex marriage thing. The church didn't have a bad year. That's the truth that had been hidden for too long. The truth has been revealed. It's supposed to set us free. And it occurs to me, if you want to see people who've had some bad years, talk to Behrooz Boushani on Manus Island. Talk to the victims of child sexual abuse who've had 50 bad years in a row. We need a church that hears the truth of the vulnerable and marginalised people in society and stands with them. I mean, Jesus Christ got crucified at the age of 33 by the political authorities because of the people he stood with and what he stood for. Now, I'm not wishing everybody to get crucified, but I'd like to see a leadership that's driven from the grassroots up and that actually is reflective of the courage of the people that do the work that you people do every day. Finally, my 1-year-old grandson's name is Lenny. He skids around on his backside. The only thing he really has recently learned to do is to pick up a mobile phone, and would you believe it, he does this. So I'm wondering, when he's my age, it'll be 2080. Yes, I am that old. Have pity upon me, please. But what's the world going to look like? What's the church going to look like? And I'm going to go so far to say that, I mean, I love the Catholic Church. I believe the Catholic Church will be a part of his life. But it's going to be a Catholic Church that is Catholic, that will include everybody, that will have women in its heart, that young people will belong, where justice means love and it's lived. I mean, it's really lived. You know, maybe the biggest battle we're going to find over this next period is yeah, sure, we've got all that good stuff. Yeah, for sure, Phil, you know, but there's an edge of cynicism in our people at the moment, you know. And I've always thought that cynicism is just an elegant form of surrender. You know? And now's not the time to give up. If you really believe this stuff, now's the time to mobilise. Let our Indigenous people lead. Let our women lead. We've got to bury clericalism. That's a future I think our young people could believe in. A church that sees that solidarity and standing with those at the edges and proclaims the Christian craziness that despite poverty, despite injustice, despite oppression, it's still possible to live on this planet like a human being. That's the world we've got to build. You know, Seamus Heaney talks about, you know, the great tide of justice rising up and hope and history rhyme. That's our challenge, to make hope and history rhyme. And standing with those at the edges. I've got a poem on my wall at work, and I'll end on this note, that I recite wherever I speak. It was written by a young, anonymous Iranian asylum seeker. He scrawled it on the wall of the room he was in Baxter Detention Centre. And he said this: "I don't know what will happen when I die. I don't want to know. But I want the potter to make a whistle from the clay of my throat, and for that whistle to fall into the hands of a naughty child, and for the child to blow on that whistle with all of the silent and suppressed air in his lungs, so that it may disturb the sleep of those who are dead to my cries." Going forward from 2022, we need a church that will never be dead to the cries of that asylum seeker or that Indigenous person or that gay, confused teenager, but stands with them, stands for them, listens to them and says, "You belong. You are not less human than me. I am you, and we are in this together."
So repeat after me. I am the church. You are the church. We are the church. I am the church. You are the church. We are the church. I am the church. You are the church. We are the church. That's the kind of church I want beyond 2020. A church that knows the big story. A church that lives the story as it's revealed to us. The church that understands that everything is mystery, really. A church that realizes that things continue to be revealed. Everything is not revealed yet. Revelation is ongoing. A church that realizes that it has the power through the Spirit to suck goodness and hope and compassion and justice out of all of us to create the kind of world that more reflects the kingdom of God. The kind of church that pays attention to the detail, that where people's feet are is where they meet God, not where somebody else says they meet God. A church that understands that everything is part of a whole, even itself. It is not a whole. The church is part of a larger whole. I'd like to see a church beyond 2020 that actually lives like a holon, that actually sees itself embedded in every human being, in every living being, that understands that it needs all the other churches and religions and traditions and indigenous expressions. It needs it all. It needs the science. It needs the psychology. It needs all the cultures. It needs every single one of them in order for it to be its whole best self. I'd like to see a church that really does believe and act that its role is in service to the life of the world, not in service to itself. I'd like to see a church that has the wonderful diversity of Australia and the United States and Iraq and China and so forth. I'd like to see a church that realizes that at the local level, that's where God lives most. I'd like to see a church that would celebrate like we have in a place like this. And so becoming a church beyond 2020, I think the church beyond 2020 is going to realize for the first and perhaps most important time that the church is the people of God, all of them, and all the time. That it's baptism that makes us members. Baptism not understood just by us, but baptism when people are welcomed into the community. That the church engages the world, the real world, the way Jesus engaged his real world, and the church is willing to pay the price for that. That the people of God, you, me, all of us, that we actually are people of welcome, and a people of hospitality. Hospitality not about a clean bed or a cuppa, but actually hospitality of the heart, where when we meet each other, we actually take each other in. The people of God who are hallmarked by respect for each other, by mutuality, by knowing that one voice up on this stage is an absolute contradiction to this entire conference. How could you possibly have one voice wrap this up? It's an oxymoron. That the respect and the mutuality, the vulnerability, that diversity is key to unity. If we don't have diversity, we will die. It's as simple as that. Obviously, the people of God will be people whose 11th commandment is thou shalt be inclusive. So what kind of inclusivity would I like to see? I think until we address the issue of race in our church, which means most of us in this room have to really look in the mirror and address our own white privilege. Racism is a consequence of white privilege. And until we have conversations as church about our living out our white privilege, the issue of race will continue to be a reality. The same with gender. I personally am not interested in anybody else being ordained. I don't care whether they're male or female. Ordination is not a gender issue. It's an issue of power. But we have to understand the gift of gender. And until we're able to have that conversation about what does it mean to be created male, female, and everything fluid on the continuum between those two ends, what does that mean? I hope the Church Beyond 2020 has a conversation about that. Same way with culture and ethnicity and age. I too, Phil, was so happy that Charlene was up here. She does bring the demographic down for sure. But under all of those issues of inclusivity, I think the conversation has to be about power and control. It has to be about domination and elitism. And it has to be about denial of reality. I love when you said, Charlene, that we ought to start acting like 2-year-olds. Why? I hope the church beyond 2020 is no longer satisfied with the answer that says, because I said so. So what kind of an attitude of mind and heart and will do each of us need in order for the church, you, me, us, to become an inclusive church? Secondly, our baptism makes us members. We have to have a conversation about identity. What does it mean to claim that we are Catholic? What does it mean to belong? Because for me to belong and Charlene to belong and Phil to belong all means something different. We have to have a conversation about belonging. I'd like to see a church that it's a community of equals. Ecclesial communion. You know, the two essential elements of ecclesial communion are hierarchy and mysticism. Both are needed. We have to let down this issue of hierarchy. Hierarchy is not the issue. It's what kind of hierarchy and who benefits from it. We have a lot of work to do, I think, in order to understand our baptized membership and to know what are the roles within the church. So ecclesial communion can, in fact, be the fruit of our life together. And the way to get there, I think, is dialogue. To actually be with one another through words in a way that we create meaning. I think we have a long way to go. So what do you need for dialogue? First, you need a desire to listen. Then you need to learn to listen. You need to listen without an agenda or an outcome. The Encuentro 5 happened in Texas back in September, and about 100 bishops went, and there were 100 of 3,000 people that were Encuentro 5. And one of the things that the young people said to the bishops was that you were here with us and you simply listened to us. You listened without an agenda. I don't know that I do that so well all the time, but listening without an agenda or without an expected outcome, Listen under the words. If I tell you I love the colors red, purple, and, green, when I ask you, what do I love? If you just repeat back to me red, yellow, and green, you haven't heard me. I'd like to hear somebody say, you like vibrancy. You like diversity. You have to listen under the words. You have to listen to hear the heart and listen for the presence and the word of God. So what attitude of mind and heart and will is needed in order for the church that is you and me and us, to become a church where dialogue is the norm? And finally, the church engages the world the way Jesus did. We need to widen the circle, which is what Charlene and Phil have each said, and we've heard it all these 3 days. My wonder is, when I go home, will I widen my own circle? For example, 7 out of 10 people on this planet can't read. 6 of them are women. I don't even know anybody who can't read. Everybody I know's got a degree. I'm living in an echo chamber. So how do I widen my circle to engage the real world? How do we increase the scope of community? Suppose when you gather 2 years from now, each one of you, each one brings one. Brings a young person, brings an elder, brings someone who you just think would enjoy this experience. What about if the invitation says you can't come unless you bring 2 others? Increase the scope of community. Enter new places of thought and awareness. Have a conversation with a millennial. I used to think they were 35-year-olds that lived in their parents' basement. Some of them are, but I'll tell you, the ones I met have changed my life. Enter new places of thought and awareness. Encounter each person in the way you would encounter God or Jesus. Just imagine if the person sitting next to you right now was Jesus Christ. Do you think for 1 minute you'd be paying attention to me? No. No. When we get to a point where we can encounter each other as if we are encountering the very flesh of God, we will have a different church. Because encounter means a willingness to fully meet the other. Fully. It's the ability to both meet and be impacted by the other. Just to meet somebody is not an encounter. When I go away from somebody or somebody goes away from me, part of me goes with that person and part of them stays with me. That's why Pope Francis says that what is needed is a culture of encounter. We need to encounter each other, not just pass like ships in the night. An intentional commitment to transformation. I said yesterday at the master class that my grandniece Mackenzie explained what goes on in the chrysalis, from a caterpillar to a butterfly. And she said, Aunt Carol, it's absolutely disgusting. Everything dies. We have to intentionally commit to understand that we are living in a time of profound transformation. And if you're holding on to something, you're not being willing to be transformed. Even if God keeps it the same and gives it back to you, it will be God's decision to do that and not ours. And a readiness, of course, to experience the mystery of God in our lives. So what attitude of mind and heart and will is needed in order for the church, me, you, and us, to become a church of encounter? Because our church is either inclusive or it's not. Asking whether the church is inclusive and you get a sort of maybe answer is like asking a woman if she's pregnant and she says a little bit. The church beyond 2020 is going to be either inclusive or it will not be. There's no middle ground. It will be one of dialogue or it will continue to be one of only didactic ways of being. And the church beyond 2020 will be one of encounter or it will be one of avoid. There's no middle. You can't have your cake and eat it too. So inclusivity, dialogue, and encounter need to become a way of life for each of us. They will continue to call us to transformation. inclusivity, dialogue, and encounter are the church beyond 2020. That's what I'm looking for beyond 2020. And inclusivity, dialogue, and encounter are who we, that's me, you, and us, need to become. So I leave here with the question, what might the world look like if the church actually became a living expression of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ? I don't know about you, but I want to give myself to that because I am the church. You are the church. We are the church. I am the church. You are the church. We are the church. I am the church. You are the church. We are the church. Let the church say amen.